Hi, I'm Harrison, and I hope you're ready for another epic historical head trip. Tonight's lecture is all about why communities of faith, be they Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, etc., Buddhist as well, should all read the Lost Science of Money and support the National Emergency Employment Defense Act. So, we're on chapter 7 tonight, and we're going to talk about the scholastics, the moral economists who prohibited usury throughout the Middle or the Dark Ages. And so before we start with that, as always, we'll start with a quick review. And since we hadn't looked at the primary, just to review the themes of the Lost Science of Money again, this is all about the primary importance of money power, meaning money creation, the way money is made. Zarlenga also demonstrates how monetary creation, the science, the process of monetary creation, has been kept censored and purposely kept secret and confused for centuries within our society and within other societies as well. How a society defines money determines who controls society. In our societies, bankers define money. They create money, and therefore they control society. And of course, this battle has raged on for millennia. But our story, the book, starts in the 40th century BC, 40,000 BC, with the Plow Revolution. And this is when the conditions for the creation of money become possible. This is when we start to see agriculture due to the plow. With agriculture comes cities and markets and trade and exchange, and this is when we start to see money being used for the first time. And money in this era was based. It was alive. It was cattle typically, or corn. One cow was worth 4 to 5 slave women or 140 talents of gold, and other items could be used as money as well. Tools were often used as money, of course. And the next major development comes in 1500 BC to 1000 BC. This is when we start to see gold become monetized in ancient Greece. This was done by their priests, and it had everything to do with tourism, with religious festivals and pilgrims, and making money off the early tourism trade. This caused all kinds of problems in ancient Greece. And then by 8th century BC, 700s, we see Lycurgus, who lived from 800 BC to 730 BC roughly. He returns to Sparta from his travels abroad, and he reforms ancient Sparta. The land is evenly divided up amongst all the free men, and Sparta institutes the Palinor system. These are iron bars soaked in vinegar, which are now completely rendered useless for anything other than exchange. And with this, according to Plutarch, Spartan society completely transforms. Crime, petty crime, gambling, theft, stuff like that disappears. There's really, really good information on our website here, Greece for Monetary Forum, and the history section about how the Spartans had the best food out of any city-state in ancient Greece as well. Really interesting stuff. And in the same century, a little bit later, we see King Numa. Late 8th century, he died in 672 BC. He was the second major king of Rome, and he was of Spartan descent. He was from the Sabine colonies, and so he most likely inherited this lost science of money from the Spartans, and he instituted a system of bronze nomisma in ancient Rome, and this is what funded the greatness of the Republic. And this bronze nomisma system lasted pretty well until the Second Punic Wars, which started in the 3rd century, when Hannibal was rampaging around ancient Rome, gobbling up the bronze nomisma. Rome shifted its money to silver. since they didn't want that bronze money being used to fund warfare against them. So they started using, this is when Rome switched to silver, and this marked the beginning of the end of the splendor of ancient Rome. After the war with Hannibal ended, they sent another black guy, General Scipio Africanus, to take out Hannibal. And then after this, we see Rome locked into an endless cycle of warfare. And soon after that, gold is also used in ancient Rome. The gold denarius first appears. And the Second Punic War set the stage for the pre-Empire Civil Wars. This is the period romanticized by Shakespeare with his version of Julius Caesar. This is the first century, from about 60 BC to 40 BC, completely wild times, as chronicled by Shakespeare, and wild times in terms of monetary policy as well. There's all sorts of different silver and gold coinage being circulated throughout ancient Rome. By 331 AD, the capital of the Roman Empire, which is now a mess, moves to Byzantium. And the position of Pontificus Maximus, the pre-runner of the Pope, Pontificus Maximus of ancient Rome, controlled the gold coinage prerogative. Only the Pontificus Maximus could coin gold coins. They had other powers as well. They regulated time, they regulated calendars, other stuff like that. But this position, which was far and away the most powerful position in the ancient world, moves to Byzantium and now becomes known as the Basileus. And they retained exclusive prerogative over coining gold, which also gives them control over the gold silver east-west exchange. So the gold to silver exchange in the east, past Byzantium into Asia, was kept lower, maybe like 1 gold piece to 6 silver pieces, whereas it was kept higher in the west, more at 12 to 1. So it was possible for merchants to move around and get a bigger return for the gold over silver. So moving forward, Charlemagne, Charlemagne's revival wasn't really a revival. We're talking about 742 to 814 AD. Zarlenga describes Charlemagne as a false dawn. He did not prepare the way for the Renaissance. He just sort of inflated the economy of the Dark Ages with warfare and slavery, which benefited the Basileus and ultimately helped drain more silver out of Charlemagne's empire in ancient Europe. Venice actually prepared the way for the Renaissance. In the early 8th century, they were able to tap into the silver-gold exchange by trading directly with Muslims, and they didn't quite figure out sovereign currency or anything like that, but they did tap into this exchange rate, and they managed to become the dominant financial power in Europe in the 8th century, beginning in the 8th century. And Venice also was critical in the Fourth Crusade. The Crusades, of course, the First Crusade features the rise of the Knights Templar, of course, and the Knights Templar, they were real, and they made a lot of money, and it wasn't necessarily about protecting pilgrims. There was really no real need to protect them from Muslim invaders. Zarlenga talks at length about how Saladin the Great welcomed pilgrims to Jerusalem and how pilgrims were treated well, and indeed how many crusaders eventually just intermarried into Muslim society. And so the First Crusades were a failure. They were bloody and horrible, but ultimately they failed just due to Saladin's generosity. But one thing that arose from this was the Knights Templar organization, and these people what they did, according to Zarlenga, what they made money off of was basically traveler's checks. Again, the whole notion that the tourism industry is new and due to capitalism is false. We see tourism throughout antiquity, and even further on. But so anyway, the Templars would essentially take silver or gold from someone in the West, and they would give them a certificate so that they could redeem their money, so that they wouldn't have to carry their money on them on their pilgrimage when they're traveling to the Holy Land or other cities. And the Templar organization made lots of money off this, so much money that they were able to basically buy out all of the monarchy of Europe. They were able to pretty much buy up a lot of real estate from the monarchy, and eventually this stopped. It began in France with King Philip. I forget the year, forgive me, but this was eventually the Templars started to relocate in Scotland, it's presumed, and this sort of explains the rise of thinkers such as Adam Smith, as well as Freemason organizations, which Zarlenga also writes about. So, but so the Templars, though, and the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade started off. It was supposed to be about retaking Jerusalem, but ultimately it turned into a sneak attack on Constantinople, and so the Venetian fleet was critical in transporting all these knights from Europe who did not want to go on a Fourth Crusade. They were forced to by the Pope. They were taxed into this, but it took them well over a year to sail all the way to Constantinople. But when they realized they were attacking Constantinople rather than Jerusalem, they were all really excited because they knew they were all going to make a lot of money. And so, fall of Constantinople in 1204 was Christian on Christian warfare, and this ultimately created a massive redistribution of money, metal money, gold and silver, from east back into the west. And the fall of Constantinople, due to the Venetians primarily, is what paved the way for the Renaissance in ancient Europe. And it was Friday the 13th October 1304 that King Philip of France began persecuting the Templar organization into hiding into Scotland, for the record. So, that's where the next chapter on the moral economists begins. We're going to talk about the scholastics. And this is the commercial revolution of the 13th century. We're talking 1160 to 1330, the long 13th century. And this is when we start to see fundamental changes in money, credit, business practices, relations in society. And this is really kind of the beginning of the present in a way. This is when we start to move away from gold and silver to pure credit, to bank money, to bookkeeping money. So, before we jump into this chapter, I want to remind you, if you can, please donate to support these lectures, because ultimately, we're not here merely to enjoy history for the sake of enjoying history. We are, of course, but this history supports a very clear solution to our current monetary crisis. We're here to share and enjoy this history in order to understand the origins of the present economic crisis. And we're not merely proposing to end the economic crisis with ideas or goodwill. We have actual legislation. It's called the National Emergency Employment Defense Act, H.R. 2990 of the 112th Congress, which was created by Dennis Kucinich after he read Lost Science of Money. This bill came out in September of 2011, just about a week before Occupy Wall Street started, which is why I didn't notice it was occupied. But no moment like the present. The whole reason I am sharing this knowledge is because A, you can't find it in graduate schools at all. We're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. This is censored history, as Zarlenga points out. I'm trying to pull my GoFundMe. There you go. I forget it. You can find my GoFundMe. I'll share it again later. Not the smoothest call to action. You can see I'm more of a historian than a marketing guru. But please support this work. We're in this for the long haul. The more you can donate, the sooner you're going to get real money. It's just a matter of time before we're able to get the right institutions to endorse this bill. Institutions which include universities. I'm going to talk about why the entire discipline of sociology needs to endorse this bill and study the lost science of money. In the second part of tonight's lecture. But we also need institutions such as communities of faith, churches, mosques, temples. We need figures from these traditional institutions to help support this bill as well. And with that, we're going to dive into a discussion of usury and the moral economists, the scholastics' prohibition on usury. So, like I mentioned, the Basilius moved from Constantinople. The pontificate, this position completely became irrelevant after the fall of Constantinople. Now, what we see is princes or kings able to start to coin their own money, and this creates a lot of chaos within the ancient world. When Pope Boniface wrote to Philip le Bel, claiming him as a subject, both in spirituals and temporals, Philip replied, "We give your foolship to know that in temporals we are subject to no person." This remark blew away the last spark of Caesar's empire, wrote Delmar. The old world had fallen. But religion would continue to play a paramount role in economic thought and activity. And the main mechanism the church had would be excommunication. But it's interesting, right when we start to see the church, the Basilius, lose control over the coining of gold, that's when we start to see the scholastics rise up and start to criticize it. So as soon as the Christian Empire loses control over this privilege, that's when we start to see them criticize it. So the church scholars were called scholastics or bookmen. These were people who knew how to read. Many of them were later canonized as saints. They were familiar with the available writings in existence and focused a good part of their attention on economic matters, particularly on usury and the just price. They were attempting to build a rationally based moral code of business behavior to determine what should be rather than what was. Their guides were the writings of the church fathers and councils that had convened over the century. The Bible was not a predominant influence on them, most references to usury being in the Old Testament. By the early 1200s, the works of Aristotle became available in the West, and he became their guiding light. So, in the scholastics' discussion of the just price, one rule of thumb they had was that you could never go beyond 50% of the just price. In other words, trading should occur between 50 and 150% of the fair price. Bernard Dempsey noted that the rules of markets of scholastics are very similar to the stated but unreached goals of today's markets. we can compare this with the invisible hand. The common market is one form which monopoly is absent, from which is excluded every machination and effort of merchants by which they bring it about that they alone have the sale of something or sell at a certain price, where the price is based on the common valuation, made in good faith, entered upon without conspiracy, without trickery, in view of the supply, the scarcity of goods, buyers and sellers, and other circumstances. In other words, the scholastics, to make a long story short, they didn't really understand the role of power and money power, specifically with regards to making markets moral. So, free bargaining was necessary. Like, they pretty much supported the existing system for the most part. The scholastics argued that money was a medium of exchange, non-determinist, somewhat of an Aristotelian definition of money. They believed if loans have no risk to the lender, therefore usury is unearned income. And they were specifically against the lender gaining unfair advantage. So, of great concern to the scholastics was whether fraud or duress existed so as to invalidate the conditions of free bargaining. Langholm noted that if one party to a contract was in the economic power of the other party and this power was wielded to obtain unjust terms of exchange, the terms did not stand. So, according to Bartolus in the 14th century, fraud existed in dealings when there was an exploitation of the immature or the mentally deficient, like old widowers. It was immoral when the borrower was in the power of the lender. This included insufficient information, withholding information. This also included blackmail or moral coercion. And the scholastics identified the immorality in usury as when the lender was causing or applying duress. The scholastics saw no difference between taking advantage of existing duress or of actively causing or applying that duress. Thomas Aquinas lived from 1225 to 1274, wrote that it was immoral for the seller to use a buyer's dire situation to demand a higher price, as the seller would then be selling something that didn't belong to him, for example, life to the starving. So the scholastics recognized private property, they weren't anarchists, but they held that in a condition of the utmost need, all things were considered as held in common, and anyone in the utmost need could take the goods held in abundance by another for the preservation of life. It's interesting to compare this with Marx's notion of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. This whole idea of moral economy. So, the scholastics concentrated more on economic and moral economics, more so than monetary reasoning. But they still had the most advanced theoretical concept of money in this period, except, of course, for those who were involved in baking. So, the scholastics correctly maintained a distinction between money and capital goods. Aristotle made this distinction as well. Second, the scholastics considered the value of money to be exempt from laws of supply and demand. In this, they were mistaken. The scholastic John Deligua clearly said the nature of money. The principal distinguishing characteristics of money is not derived from the material, but from the value by which it is formally constituted in the nature of money. And he distinguishes between material, formal money, commodity money versus legal money, nominal money, as Aristotle would define it. And so the chief failure of the scholastics was that they entirely missed this distinction. They, more importantly, missed the importance of bank-created deposits used as money. Over a period of several centuries, deposit creation was as an economic phenomenon is unmentioned by them, wrote Newman. This unfortunate oversight is one reason for the lack of moral condemnation of such deposit creation in the present day, whereby banks substitute credit for money through a process known as fractional reserve banking, which we can describe later in our lectures. But we're talking about, this is when we start to see the rise of bookkeeping money. Money just created, not even out of relation to a commodity like silver or gold, but just out of a book. Just credit, debt. So, the Knights Templars we discussed were some of the first to use this, and now merchants were starting to pick up on this more throughout Europe. It must have soon become apparent to the Templars, the Italian merchant bakers, and the great German lending houses that they possessed the power to create money in the form of bookkeeping credits on their books. So loans wouldn't have to be made in coinage. Loans are made just by writing in credits into the borrower's account. The borrower would have the ability to write checks in that account. Once the borrowers got in the habit of using checks, back then called bills of exchange, the banker could increase the money supply with these credits. These credits would be used as a means of exchange as money. But the new accounting money came with usury. These were loans, not based on any actual equity. The church scholars, the scholastics, had not known about the sleight of hand and thus could not shine the sin of usury on it. Today, this is legal and is the basis of our banking system, but it is still a well-kept secret. So, the church was successful in prohibiting usury for several hundred years, however, until this practice of bank money started to increasingly elude their awareness. The scholastic prime economic concern was the practice of usury, and their theory of usury is the first attempt at a science of economics in the West. They had observed the bad effects of usury and had an intuitive insight into the problem, which is now only becoming apparent, wrote Noonan. They based their condemnation of usury on reasoning and observation, on divine, natural, and human law. They weren't against all interest. They weren't even against all usury. At no times was it forbidden to take interest under proper conditions. The key was whether the lender was actually taking some risk without certain gain. Venice had utilized advanced financial structures for hundreds of years, rising to the commercial domination of Europe without violating the bans on usury. Usury is not the same thing as just charging interest. It was taking unfair advantage. We talked about the different types of usury already, mentally deficient, lack of information, under power or coercion. But two types of loans were always exempt. The first were the societas, where the lender assumes some proportion of the risk in enterprise. Most of Venice's collegenza partnerships were in this category. They're merchant partnerships, which involved dangerous seafaring expeditions. And second was the census. This was an obligation to pay an annual return based on some fruitful property. At first it was paid in real produce, but later it started getting paid in money. And but the risk of the fruitful base was on the lender, not the borrower, which meant that if a crop failed or was destroyed by the weather, the borrower had no obligation that year. Later, cities started to issue census obligations based on tax revenue, which became called rent. So that stuff was always exempt. The moral economists didn't take this to any ideological extremes. There were other, most of the prohibitions against usury, there are more prohibitions than usury in the Old Testament, which has very strong prohibitions against usury. Jews were strictly forbidden from taking usury from their brothers, other Jews, and were discouraged in taking it from stranger. Zarlenga lists the Old Testament references to usury. I don't have a Bible. I couldn't tell you what they are. Well, here's one. So Luke 6:34 through 35. But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again, and your reward shall be great. And ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil. So, there's lots of other important prohibitions against usury from many other different faiths. The Code of Hammurabi excludes it, 2130 to 2088 BC. Usury was limited to 33%. Like Kyrgyz's constitution in the 8th century, and Solange's reform banned it. Roman law, many instances in which it was completely limited, if not prohibited. The Quran totally forbade usury. Even Charlemagne forbade usury in 806. Magna Carta limits usury, and according to Zarlenga, most states in the United States enforced the usury limits until 1981. What's really important is that in 1850, at the Synod of Paris, usurers are now potential to become excommunicated. This is really important. This helps enforce the usury ban. This is the main mechanism of enforcement behind the ban. The Second Lateran Council, 1139, declared that unrepentant usurers were condemned by both the Old and the New Testaments. In 1185 through 87, Pope Urban III citation of the words Christ, lend freely, hoping nothing thereby. And this again is Luke 6:35. This had a strong impact. Saint Bernardine of Siena, 1380 to 1444, noted that public usurers were usually foreigners, often Jews, and that they drained the wealth of the city into other lands. They started to notice that usury concentrates the money of the community into the hands of the few. It is a contagious disease, for now all men are usurers. One person starts to be a usurer, all men become usurers. William of Auxerre, 1160 to 1220, eloquently wrote that usury was against natural law and was innately sinful, yet men pursue it as if it were a business and a way of living. The usurer injures all creatures, even the stones. Whence, if men were silent against the usurers, the stones would cry out if they could. It was the sinfulness of selling time, which only God can give. Pope Innocent IV, 1250 through 1261, said usury is prohibited because of the evil consequences that follow from the practice. If usury were permitted, all rich persons would rather put their money safely in a usurious loan than invest in agriculture. Only the poor would be left to the farming, and then they would not possess the animals and tools with which to farm. Famine would result. Innocent's argument might be added, it may seem naive or exaggerated at first, but the experience of agricultural communities, such as ancient Greece or China, throughout most of history, offer considerable corroboration. And, I mean, the only thing about this paragraph that we need to change in order to apply to our times is that we see rich people putting their money into usury rather than into factories more so than agriculture. There's no real economy anymore. This is what we're talking about. Usury is a bigger economy than actual reality, actual goods, actual food, actual services. And this is what we're fighting against. So, Henry Pirney in Medieval Cities remarks, the scourge of debts, which in Greek and Roman antiquity so sorely afflicted the people, was spared the social order of the Middle Ages, and it may be that the church contributed to that happy result. So again, we start, the usury ban seems to have helped people in the Middle Ages, and we typically think of the Middle Ages as a Great Depression, the world's longest, oldest Great Depression. William George often says that. But other scholars, such as Heisega and even Weber to some extent, they talk about the quality of life during the Middle Ages being somewhat happier than now. And apparently this has to do with the ban on usury, and to some limited extent it helped. It challenges this whole notion that expansion is necessarily better, where the Dark Age is really necessarily dark in terms of people's actual day-to-day experience. They were dark in terms of economic expansion, but is that necessarily a good thing? We're going to return to this idea of the scourge of debts in Greece and Rome versus the Middle Ages, again with Max Weber. Moving forward though, the scholastics talked about something called the infinite appetite. Over time, the money system, usury will destroy the money system, since there's no finite limit to greed. Usury is evil because it is unsocial, illiberal, and because the usurer seeks avariciously that which has no finite limits. This places its results outside the nature, often outside the possible. Think of Durkheim's anomie, for those of you who are sociologically literate. Zarlenga talks about Dante's references to usury and the Divine Comedy, and it offends the divine goodness. From these two, philosophy and physics, it behooves mankind to gain their life in advance, but because the usurer holds another way, he condemns nature in herself and in her followers, since upon other things he sets his hope. Dante even gave the usurers a special corner in hell. Their woe was bursting forth through their eyes, and when I set my eyes on the face of certain of those whom the grievous fire falls, I did not recognize one of them, but I perceived that from the neck of each was hanging a pouch, which had a certain color and a certain device. Aristotle condemned usury, and this was really the basis for the Church's condemnation of usury, according to Zarlenga. The Catholic Church's condemnation of usury had more to do with Aristotle than Jesus, supposedly. So, Aristotle became popular again in Europe around 1250 with the bookmen, the scholastics. And Albert the Great was teaching Aristotle in Cologne. Albert the Great lived from 1206 to 1280. He was the acknowledged Aristotelian master and the most influential medieval authority on science and philosophy. And St. Thomas Aquinas was one of his students. They called Aristotle the philosopher, just the philosopher. The most hated sort of wealth getting, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. And this term interest, tokos, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money because the offspring resembles its parent. Wherefore, all modes of getting wealth, this is the most unnatural. And that's from Aristotle's The Politics. Those who ply sordid trades, pimps, and all such people, and those who lend small sums at high rates, for all these take more than they ought, and from the wrong sources. What is common to them is evidently a sordid love of gain, and that's from the Nicomachean Ethics. So Aristotle is saying that money, in principle, is sterile. It does not beget more money the way as cows beget more cows, or fields grow more grain. He says that usury on money is contrary to the purpose of money, created by a society as a measure, a medium of exchange. He also attacks usurers based on his observation of their bad behavior and character. St. Thomas Aquinas agreed with Aristotle's view on money. He agreed that money is a measure, and that usury diversifies the measure. Aquinas meant that placing additional functional demands on the money system, as usury does, harms its function as a measure. Other scholars such as Henry of Ghent and Alexander Lombard agreed with this notion that money is just a medium of exchange. Aristotle's term for usury is chrematistics, or crematism. Crema is a word for money in Greek. But in English, the best word for the structural misuse of society's money system is usury. The current misdefinition of the term as the taking of excessive interest shows how far we have been led from understanding this subject. So, this is important. Usury isn't just taking excessive interest, it's actual misuse of the money system. That's our definition of this. And this misuse, this systematic misuse of the money system, is what we identify as the central defining aspect of capitalism. And I'm going to show you how Weber's sociology supports that notion, contrary to what Zarlenga says about him. So, in medieval times, judicial action was only taken against the manifest usurers, those practicing it openly. The Jews, the small minority of Jews who were engaged in it, and the Lombards, the pawnbrokers of the Middle Ages. Discreet usurers, those who employed semantic tricks, making loans, were mainly worried about excommunication and being denied the holy sacraments, especially burial on sacred ground. In order to expite the mortal sin of usury, it was necessary for the usurer to make monetary restitution to his victims, and if he couldn't find them, to the poor through the church. Vast amounts of money were left to the church for the benefit of souls departing usurers. The heirs of usurers were also required to make restitution. So there's lots of semantic tricks practiced by merchants and lawyers to get around the usury ban. Every conceivable semantic trick was used to get around the prohibition. Goods were sold on credit at a higher price, which factored interest into it, so a cheaper in-person price and a higher price at credit. Dry exchange bills in foreign currency were executed but not sent for collection and later resold to the borrower, the maker of the bill, for a higher amount reflecting interest. The rationale is that it was a fee to exchange money, and the church never tried to regulate these foreign exchange dealings. But it condemned it if its purpose was really usury, and its users were expected to make restitution. Most of the writings of the scholastics were not addressed to consumptive, non-productive loans, but to commercial loans. And as economies became more dynamic, with growth possibilities, it was becoming clear that charging interest on business loans but the borrowing merchant prospered couldn't be condemned as greed or lack of charity. So, by the end of the medieval period, the only really two important arguments still against usury were Aristotle's point that money is sterile, and that usury is counter to the purpose of money. And this is backed by Aquinas' argument that the usurer could not sell both the money and the use of it. So we start to see the fall of the usury prohibition. With an increasingly powerful money-lending class and the church's moral power weakened by corruption, it was just a matter of time and money before the floodgates would be opened. By 1516, the idea of a lending institution charging interest for its services had been widely accepted, whereas it had not been before. So the corruption that we're talking about too, that weakened the church's moral power against usury, had to do with selling of indulgences, which was a major source of the Protestant Reformation. Protestants argued that this was a major source of abuses and corruption. So this weakened the usury prohibition. And so by 1516, this powerful money-lending class, who was making money through the selling of indulgences, remember the Fuggers, this is how they made their money. And after they made enough of their money, they started to actually start to create economic rationale for interest. In 1515, the city of Augsburg, hometown of the Fuggers, which was challenging Florence for financial leadership of Europe, the Fuggers financed John Eck, a student of Summenhart, to argue his thesis allowing a certain type of usurious contract. This was the so-called guaranteed insured contract, also known as the triple contract, the German contract, or the 5% contract. John Eck argued his thesis for 5 hours before the full assembled University of Bologna, and then the most celebrated school of canon law in Europe. John Eck made this triple contract known to all and assured everyone that it had been used for over 40 years with no one being denied the sacraments. John Calvin is really responsible for finishing off the usury ban in 1536. His arguments were shallow compared to the attention the scholastics gave to the problem, according to Zarlenga. Calvin put aside the Aristotelian argument on the purpose of money. He also disputed Aristotle's concept of free will, placing Calvinism in an even more profound opposition to Greek philosophy than the Catholic Church had been. So the church was moving very slowly on usury. In terms of the church didn't move quickly enough in terms of understanding usury. Even in 1917, in the Codex Canonici, it was still left slightly unclear. The church appears to be aware of the grave problems associated with usury, but has not had the courage or ability to discuss them openly. The scholastics held back the usury deluge for centuries. One of their lasting contributions has been to identify that monetary and economic questions are profoundly moral issues. So Calvin, of course, was responding to Martin Luther, who was the forerunner, the first reformer against the church's corruption. His 95 Theses were pounded at that door in 1517 in Wittenberg. And Thesis 67 references the indulgences, which the merchants extolled. And this was their favorite means of money getting. And Martin Luther wrote that if companies are to go on, then that will be the end of law and honesty. He was infuriated by the corruption and attacked the Pope in colorful language, which by today's standards would be four-letter words. On usury specifically, Luther went through three periods, according to Zarlenga. First, he condemned anyone who charged interest as a thief, robber, and murderer. Money is an unfruitful commodity which I cannot sell in such a way as to entitle me to profit. Next, from 1523 to 1525, Luther was somewhat reconciled to usury after he was frightened by the peasant revolts and their preacher leaders such as Dr. Jacob Strauss of Eisenach. These populists used the Mosaic law of the Bible to threaten the concept of private property. And Luther condemned any popular initiatives in this revolt, and he claimed that reform had to originate with princes. But then, after a 15-year silence on usury, in the midst of a severe usury economic crisis in 1539, Luther again blasted the usurers, starting with the princes. He became a kind of bridge between, Martin Usary became kind of a bridge between Luther and Calvin on the usury question. He preached that the Old Testament prohibition only forbade biting usury. Fortunately, Martin Luther was not aware of the advanced usury concepts developed by the scholastics. Luther tore the whole of this beautiful fabric to the ground and carried back the teaching on usury to the primitive bare prohibition of all gains on loans, with the inevitable result that it could not be lived up to with the facts of modern life, and that it consequently fell into disrepute. So again, what Zarlenga calls bibliolatry, we see not working out in real life. This whole idea of using Bible prohibitions from the Bible, such as the usury prohibition from the Old Testament, just not working out in this modern era of credit. And we see the same sort of thing, within the left. We hear certain anarchists wanting to return to barter and trade, or certain Bitcoin evangelicals just blindly putting their faith in Bitcoin, which could have some help, but overall, it's not possible just to go back to a pure barter and trade standard, because that's just not how it worked out in the first place if we look at anthropological evidence as accumulated by David Graeber. So Luther appeared at a time when the commercial importance of the Germanic peoples had been growing. This is the Hanseatic League in the north, which we covered, in the Fuggers and the financiers of Augsburg in the south. Calvin accepted usury compared to Luther, who outright completely banned it. Calvin's father, Gerard, was accused of embezzlement from the church. He refused to render accounts to the cathedral authorities at Notre Dame. And the Holy Sacraments had been denied to the household, which helps explain some of Calvin's actions against the church. Calvin's father, Gerard, was excluded from burial in consecrated lands, and this is why Calvin became a lawyer. So, there's four theorists specifically who talk about Calvin's Reformation, the most important which, of course, being Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And Calvin's teachings were addressed primarily to the classes engaged in trade and industry. He began by attacking Luther immediately. Rather than reforming the priesthood and the hierarchy, Calvin did away with it. Instead of reforming it like Luther wanted to, he just did away with it entirely. And this had a big impact for Protestants. Under the Catholic, the great goal of the faithful was the salvation of their souls for eternity, Under the Catholic Church, this was achieved through faith. Good works and the sacraments administered by the priesthood. Calvin eliminated these by preaching the doctrine of a chosen people, the elect, chosen by God's gratuitous mercy, totally irrespective of human merit. The remainder had been consigned to eternal damnation by just, irreprehensible, but incomprehensible judgment. So, this eliminates free will. Man is not possessed of free will for good works unless he be assisted by grace, and that special grace which is bestowed on the elect alone in regeneration. Calvin realized that this was irreconcilable with Greek philosophy, and he continued to argue that it was divine election which distinguishes among saved and damned men. Calvin's tenet that good works don't matter removed the potential of his code to guide human behavior, limiting its value as a moral code. Denying the efficacy of good deeds and of the human will, and leaving on the one side as useless all of the doctrine and tradition of holy poverty, Calvin opened the door to the domination of the mind by money. St. Thomas Aquinas had said it centuries before that if men abandoned the idea of God as in supreme good, they would tend to replace him by the idea implicit, not directly stated, that material wealth is the supreme good. Locke characterized the Reformation as a rising of the rich against the poor, and indeed Calvin wrote that people must always be kept in poverty in order that they may remain obedient. And so the closing of the communion to God through the church had serious effects. Mainly Protestants were very lonely people, as Weber would point out. But this also leads to the deification of the Bible. Calvin maintained that the scriptures are self-authenticated and ought not to be made the subject of demonstration and arguments from human reason. Noting that the elimination of the priests and their fees was evidently a device of the mercantile community, and the savings to those who accepted it were enormous, but disintegrated Christendom made an organized priesthood impossible. So it was the followers of Calvin, specifically the Puritans, who first elevated the Old Testament in a position of supreme importance. And it fell back on the Old Testament and the Jewish standards of commercial dealing. Calvin relied on the Hebrew text instead of the Greek Bible, which would have included more of Aristotle's works on money and so forth. The doubts which have been raised concerning the veracity of the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, and the willful malicious tampering with it. One reason for adopting Hebrew over Greek could have been an attempt to block out the teachings of Aristotle, which a knowledge of the Greek language would have encouraged and facilitated. Calvinism was thus an elevating of Jerusalem over Athens, of east over west. And Zarlenga writes that Judaism's religious influence grew and eventually dominated in the West through Calvinism. So another economic result of Calvinism is a doctrine of promoting competition, or an idea of competition. Performance on the terms of agreed upon contracts became the overriding determinant of commercial justice, apart from the contents of the contract or any unfair circumstances which led to their being accepted. This led to an ever-widening gulf between morality and the law. The study of economics would eventually come to reject considerations of morality. The imposing but also terrible expansion of modern capitalism, with its calculating coldness and soullessness, its unscrupulousness and pitilessness, its turning to gain for gain's sake to fierce and ruthless competition, its agonizing lust of victory, his blatant satisfaction of the tyrannical power of the merchant class, has entirely loosed it from its former ethical foundation and has become a power directly opposed to genuine Calvinism and Protestantism, according to Ernst Troeltsch. In the spiritual realm, according to Bloch, the efforts were distaste for joy and ease and beauty, an isolation of the soul through the elimination of private confession. Weber talks about how the Protestants were against the uninhibited enjoyment of life. The Protestants were the first people who historically started to accumulate just for the sake of accumulation, in order to convince other people in their community that they were chosen by God for having. It wasn't about enjoying the wealth in your earthly life. So, with Calvin, we start to see the seizure of church lands. We start to see serfs getting pushed off lands. In England, we see rulers start to seize church lands. The Tudors began taking Catholic lands in 1536, 1553. This happened in France. French nobles seized monasteries. Serfs were expelled without any means of survival. Nobles should extend their legal rights of ownership while repudiating legal obligations. And Calvin appealed to the French nobility to take monasteries in France. However, this process, especially in England, where the serfs who had been allowed to use the church lands were increasingly expelled without any means of survival, more and more lands are starting to become enclosed. This, of course, eventually would pave the way for English Puritanism and eventually the new colonies in the States. And the first Puritans were encouraged by the merchant class, and the voyage made by the Venetian John Cabot under the patent of Henry VII of England was financed by Italian bankers. So bankers were encouraging these people to work as missionaries, essentially. And Zarlenga also writes here a little bit about bibliolatry, which is worshipping the Bible as the absolute Word of God. He talks about how this development, which is widespread in our country today, began with John Calvin. Christian sects that are growing in America and have taken on an especially political character have regressed to bibliolatry. We've seen this factor growing in political debates where its main effect has been to ignore conditions of economic justice. Zarlenga writes that the Bible can be used to render civil government ineffective. He also attributes the September 11th tax of 2001 to an indirect deification. There's an indirect result of the deification of religious scriptures, the Quran in this case. And he argues that looking at the Bible or the Quran as a literal word of God inevitably limits the mind's ability to use the full methodology available to human beings for gaining knowledge, mainly observation, reason, logic, intuition, memory, transferring analogous conceptual structures, even authority. So, with that, bibliolatry, we can sort of see the genealogy of groups like the Westboro Baptist Church and all the problems that they cause within our contemporary life. Weber Max Weber is one of the most important anti-capitalist thinkers, and he wrote a lot about the Reformation. He wrote about this time period as sort of being the rise of modern-day capitalism, and for good reason. But Zarlenga is very critical of Weber for a lot of reasons which don't stand up. So, Zarlenga writes that Weber largely excluded the problem of usury within capitalism when he defined the spirit of capitalism as naturally that of modern rational enterprise peculiar to the Occidental West, not the sort of capitalism spread over the world for 3,000 years, from China to Babylon to Greece to Rome to Florence, to present carried on by users, military contractors, traders and offers, tax farmers, large merchants, financial magistrates. Zarlenga argues that Weber looks at capitalism primarily as rational industrial organization attuned to regular market, not to political or irrational speculative opportunities for profit. Zarlenga writes, and I'm not agreeing with this, that it's now clear that capitalism as we know it is a different animal from the form of benign industrial organization Weber was describing. And I don't even think Zarlenga actually read Weber's book, because Weber does not describe capitalism as any way benign. Zarlenga continues, in short, Weber did not fully appreciate the degree of power that private money issuing privilege concentrates in the hands of those who hold it. And I'm going to show you how this is not true within Weber's thought. He paid a lot of attention to money creation and to the consequences of money creation as well. But Zarlenga misses it. I don't know why Stephen missed it. Zarlenga writes, Weber does not specifically discuss the issue of money issuing privilege in the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. I'm going to show how that's not complete, how Zarlenga's criticism is not completely true. Zarlenga notes that his treatment, his criticism of Weber, receives some objections in the German language edition of this book, and I'm not surprised because the Germans should know Weber a little bit better. But Zarlenga writes, and this is horrible, it may be convenient to teach Weber's now outdated definition of capitalism in American schools, but as we entered the third millennium, perhaps it is time to drop this children's version so popular with bankers and their apologists and examine the money and banking systems for what they really are. So, It took me a while to get this lecture prepared because of the scope of Stephen's oversight. He missed a lot. Weber absolutely does acknowledge the role of banking and money in the rise of modern capitalism. There are a few references to it in the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, but this book is like The Hobbit. Okay, like you don't talk about Weber based solely on the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, because his magnum opus is Economy and Society. It's 2 volumes, it's several thousand pages, and if Zarlenga doesn't cite Economy and Society in The Lost Science of Money at all. This book does not reference this book, and it's a major oversight on Stephen's part, because Weber does talk about money creation. He does talk about debt. And he even talks about modern monetary money systems in these books, and we're about to go over that for a minute. That was just sort of the warm-up for the real part of the lecture, which is starting now. So, first off, I don't think Stephen even read The Lost Science of Money, because Weber was in no way thought capitalism was benign. He was very, very distressed and very concerned about it. He was, Weber was a child of He had a really devout Calvinist mother, and he had a father who was very into earthly pleasures. Didn't get along very well with his father. Weber got severely depressed after his father died, but Weber was very, very worried about modern life and capitalism, and he talked about disillusionment with life under modern capitalism. He talked about modern capitalism being this endless cycle of loneliness and work and disenchantment, not at all benign. So, Weber writes, the Puritans wanted to be men of the calling. We, on the other hand, must be, much the same way that we talked about how usury forces other people to become usurers. Today, this mighty cosmos determines with overwhelming coercion the style of life not only of those directly involved in business, but of every individual who is born into this mechanism, and may well continue to do so until the last day that the last ton of fossil fuel has been consumed. So he's very aware of the correlations between modern capitalism and environmental destruction. Weber was also very cynical about the prospects of capitalism changing. We compare this with Marx, who was confident that capitalism would be so disastrous the state would have to take over, and eventually this would pave the way for a communist revolution. This isn't how Weber saw things working out. No one yet knows who will live in that shell or cage, depending on which interpretation you're reading, in the future. Perhaps new prophets will emerge, or powerful old ideas and ideals will be reborn at the end of this monstrous development. It might be said of the last men in this cultural development, specialists without spirit, hedonists without a heart, these non-entities imagine they have attained a stage of humankind never before reached. The shell or the cage metaphor of Weber is what this book is perhaps best known for. But the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism is actually a really just short portion of this book. A lot of this is actually footnotes and replies to it. And in my version of this, in the appendix, the second appendix, there's some really, really important notes here that have a lot to do with what we're talking about. Weber writes, at the outset of the enterprise, there must be a starting balance sheet. Before each individual action, there must be a calculation. At the stage of applying controls and checks on the appropriateness of procedures, there must be a post-calculation, a conclusion. When the profit is assessed, there must be a final balance sheet. So, what Weber is mostly known for is the sociology of religion, and he's known for what we talk about as rationalization, this increasing sense that everything in the world is knowable and understandable and predictable. He talks about the disillusionment that people have with society. There's no more mystery. There's no more romance left to the world. So, it's very common for sociologists, for beginning in intro classes, to compare and contrast Weber's concept of rationalization with Marx's concept of alienation, the experience that the worker feels on the assembly line when they're alienated from the means of producing their product, much less the profits from their labor. And so a lot of sociologists tend to look at this idea of rationalization as sort of a spiritual kind of phenomenon. And it absolutely is, but with what we're understanding here now from the Lost Science of Money, looking at this and reading this again, Weber's actually talking about balance sheets. He's actually talking about calculation and credit. I mean, he's talking about profit Where rationality prevails, the calculation is the foundation for every single action of those partners. Calculation. My suspicion is that this needs to be reinterpreted. This is originally written in German, but the role of credit becomes increasingly important in economy and society. And we do see some more references to it here. The West has acquired a degree of importance, something which explains the importance, and has produced variety, forms, and kinds of capitalism that have never existed before. Throughout all the world, there have been traders, wholesale and retail traders, local and long distance. There have been money-lending businesses of all kinds. There have been banks with highly varied functions, but functions which, at least in essence, resemble our 16th century banks. Loans for voyages commended, businesses and associations of the limited liability type have been widespread, including those run on a business-like basis. Whenever public corporations required money to finance their undertakings, the financial backers were there. In Babylon, Hellas, India, China, or Rome, they were required for the financing of especially wars and piracy, for sending supplies, and for buildings of all kinds. In overseas policy, they appeared as colonial entrepreneurs, plantation purchasers, and managers, employers of slave labor, or of directly or indirectly press-gang workers. They are involved in farming out estates, offices, especially taxation, financing of party bosses for election purposes, and of condottieri, mercenaries for the purposes of civil war. So, again, he's very, very clear in pointing to the role of money and bankers, moneylenders specifically, in the development of conquest and colonialism and slavery. These kinds of entrepreneur figures, capitalist adventurers, have existed all over the world, except where they were engaged in trade or in credit and banking businesses. Their opportunities for profit were essentially either purely irrational and speculative, or they were centered upon the acquisition of booty by force, whether in the course of waging war or exacted over time by physical means, plundering of other people. So Weber's a little hard to read. He's more likely to list multiple exceptions to a rule before he even lists a rule. It has to do with his method of interpretive sociology, which is very opposed to French positivist sociology as done by Durkheim, who's trying to apply biological models of social science to this. So, Weber's very likely to allude to a lot of inconvenient facts. He's apt to list a lot of exceptions to the rule, and what he calls rules are ideal types, just norms. He's looking for social trends, but he's describing them in general terms, general abstract terms. And he knows that these aren't concrete examples, but what he's saying here with this is that credit and banking are basically the source of acquisition of booty by force, the source of waging war, and of plundering other peoples. I mean, it's right here in the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, contrary to what Stephen argues. And to take it even further, to give it some more historical concreteness, furthermore, in the history of the origin of the modern banks, including the Bank of England, most of which evolved from political businesses motivated by the needs of war, politically oriented adventure capitalism and rational business capitalism are extremely closely linked. An example of this is the antithesis between the individuality of, for example, Patterson, a typical promoter, and those members of the board who were responsible for this stance of that institution and were very soon characterized as the Puritan usurers of Grocers' Hall. Another is the blunder committed by this most solid bank at the time of the founding of the South Sea Company. Hour mark?
An hour and 20.
Wow, alright, so we're getting there. We're almost done, but you can see why this lecture slowed me down for a few weeks and why it's taken me so long to put this lecture together, because Zarlenga was just dead wrong in his analysis of Weber in terms of the importance of credit and debt within Weber. Had Zarlenga, the good news is, to make a long story a little bit shorter, is that everything Max Weber has to say about money and debt and credit confirms everything that Stephen has to say about it in this book, as we're about to find. And the real tragedy in this for Stephen is that he could have found a major source of support in Max Weber had he not been so busy trying to grandstand and make himself seem more important than Weber. It's not entirely Stephen's fault that he missed a lot of the stuff, as Weber's writings on money and credit typically aren't as well known or as well assigned in graduate school courses as is Weber's writings about traditional legal and charismatic authority, for example, or class status and party, or sociology of religion and the aesthetic rejections of the world. But all of those things come after his discussions of credit and money in economy and society. And this was his magnum opus. It was published after he died by his wife. But had Zarlenga read this book, he would have actually come across an entire chapter on the ban of usury and the just price and the downgrading of secular vocational ethics. I mean, there's a chapter in Economy Society by Weber that perfectly complements the chapter we just read, and there's a few things from here that I want to point out to you. All churches have viewed with deep distrust the rise of this alien impersonal power, capitalism, and most of them took a stance against it. And so he talks a little bit about usury and the just price. Both belong together and originate in the primeval ethic of the neighborhood, which knows barter only as the exchange of occasional surpluses or products of one's own labor, work for others only as neighborly help, and loans only as help in need. Among brothers, one does not haggle for the price, but asks merely for the restitution of one's own costs, including the living wage, if exchange takes place at all. Mutual labor assistance is either provided without compensation or in return for a meal and no gain, but possibly reciprocity is expected from the loan of dispensable goods. Interest is demanded by the ruler, profit by the tribal alien, not by a brother. The debtor is actually or potentially a serf. The injunctions against usury should not be deduced in too materialistic a manner as reflections of a specific situation. The predominance of consumer credit, interest-free producers' credit, is known to Oriental law in the earliest extant contracts as loan of seed corn for a share in the yield. Weber was aware of the original use of interest in the form of seed corn or cow. He's aware of the usury error. Historically, it applied first only to the clergy in loans, and even their interest, and even there only in relation to brothers, not aliens. In the early Middle Ages, when the natural economy and consumers' credit predominated, the ban was disregarded time and time again by the clergy itself. However, it was taken seriously almost at the same moment when capitalist production credit, more correctly commercial credit, became important first in overseas trade. For commerce, the ban was tolerable at first because in the most important cases, credit was taken up only against shares in profits and losses. Some guilds, for example, like that in Florence, periodically bought a general absolution for the inevitable usury pravitas, and at the end of his life, the individual merchant paid conscious money or stipulated in his will, and then the ingenuity of the lawyers exhausted itself in the invention of legal forms which circumvented the prohibition of usury in the capitalist interest. The church, in turn, established the Montes Pieties, the Mounts of Piety, pawnshops for emergency loans to the petty bourgeoisie. However, the ban on usury was nowhere really successful in curbing the development of capitalism. Increasingly, it became more impediment in commercial life. Calvinism produced the first theoretical justification of interest, just like Zarlenga writes, and Weber's writing this in 1919. In general, it appears scarcely admissible to say that the church had an economic program. The church did not decisively influence basic institutions in antiquity as well as in the Middle Ages. For example, it had no major share in the waning of such a fundamental institution as slavery. Insofar as it took a stand in modern history, it lagged behind the economic facts and later behind the protest of the Enlightenment. Insofar as religious influences were important, they emanated from the sects, not from the main church, especially the Quakers, although in practice even they often ignored their hostility to slavery. Nevertheless, the influence of the medieval church was not insignificant, but extraordinarily great. But it did not make or unmake institutions as much as it molded attitudes, and even then its influence was essentially negative. Against the forces of capitalism, the church has reinforced all personal patriarchal authority and all peasant and petty bourgeois traditionalist interests, fully in accordance with the rationale of hierarchy. The church looks at layman's doings with a certain tolerance if he bows to its authority, and in Buddhism presents it with gifts. Most importantly, the church lets the layman periodically relieve himself of his sins in the oral confession, which was the clergy's most powerful instrument. So again, we see the same argument. Weber's essentially writing about how merchants got around the usury prohibition. There's so many references to this throughout this book. Money pops up throughout economy and society. I haven't had a chance to fully check it out, but again, with regards to this same chapter we just read on the Middle Ages, Weber has another chapter called The Origin of the Ancient Lower Class, Debtors and Slaves. And here he's contrasting lowest strata of antiquity and that of Middle Ages. It's very sharp. The ancient city experienced as the chief danger arising from economic differentiation, which all parties therefore sought to combat with varying means. The emergence of a class of full citizens, descendants of family of full citizenship rights, who were economically ruined, in debt, without property, no longer capable of equipping themselves for service in the army, and who hoped for a revolution or a tyranny from which they could demand a redistribution of land, a cancellation of debts, or support out of public means, grain distributions, free admission to festivities, dramatic performances and circus fights, or direct doles from public funds to make possible their attendance at such performances. It is true that such strata were not entirely unknown in the Middle Ages. They could be found also in more recent times in the south of the United States, where the slave-holding plutocracy was confronted by unproprietary poor white trash. In the Middle Ages, the debt-ridden classe strata of the nobility were as much an object of concern as they were in Rome, but on the whole, this problem played a very small role in the Middle Ages. Above all, in democratic cities, it was certainly not the starting point for class struggles as it typically was in antiquity. Think Spartacus revolt. For For the class struggles of early antiquity took place between the urban patriciate as creditors and the peasants debtors, or as dispossessed debt slaves. But in the typical city of the medieval Occident, slave labor played a rapidly diminishing economic role and ultimately not at all. Nor would the powerful craft guilds have tolerated the development of an artisan stratum of slaves paying body rent to their master as competitors of the free crafts. This is precisely what happened in antiquity by way of contrast. They were also, as the fullest expansion of the slaves in ancient Greece, fell precisely in the periods of their democracy. So, again, I mean, Zarlenga's claim that Weber ignores the role of debt and credit and money in the rise of capitalism is dead wrong. Completely dead wrong. And just to move forward a little bit more, I'm gonna start to wrap up the lecture with Weber's definition of money, which he pulls out well before he writes about his better-known writings, and as well as Weber's discussion of modern monetary systems, which is very, very important with regards to convincing the rest of the entire discipline of sociology to get involved in reading the law, science, money, and supporting National Emergency Employment and Defense Act. Excuse me while I freshen up a little. I need some more brain cells to get through this lecture. Because the implications of this are profound. This is stuff my teachers haven't even taught me about Max Weber. I doubt that this is stuff they've read recently, and I doubt that this is stuff that they'd be able to understand without reading law, science, and money first. I doubt I would have been able. I wasn't able to understand what Weber was writing in these sections until I read the law, science, and money. But now it makes sense. So, Weber writes extensively about money right after he starts defining basic terms like social action, which is really important. There's different references here. So long as there's no officially sanctioned money, that what is used as means of exchange is primarily determined by the customs, interests, and conventions to which the agreements between the parties to transactions are orientated, which is pretty much what David Graeber found in Debt the first 5,000 years as well, doing an anthropology of debt. But Graeber doesn't even reference these pages in his index or bibliography. Weber also heavily references scholar George Knapp, who Zarlenga references repeatedly throughout the law, science, and money, and Weber talks about, Weber uses a lot of Knapp's terms, such as chattel, which refers to any stamped or coined money endowed with validity by law or agreement, so government money, stamped gold or silver specifically. Joseph Knapp has pointed out the fact that various types have existed, such as obligations stemming from tribal dowries, payments for bribe purchases, conventional gifts to kings by kings to each other, and the fact that these have often been payable in certain specific media created for these media by convention, by law, by specific position. Again, agreeing with Aristotle's definition of money by law, as well as Graeber's anthropology of the origin of money through dowries. So, credit. So, after Weber defines all this stuff about money, he starts to talk about the primary consequences of the widespread use of money. So-called indirect exchange is a means of satisfying consumers' wants. The use of money makes it possible to obtain goods which are separated from those offered in exchange for them in space and time, in respect to persons involved, and what is very important, in respect to quantity on each side of the transaction. This results in a tremendous extension of the area of possible exchange relationships. Valuation in terms of money of related obligations, especially of compensatory obligations arising out of an exchange, that is debts. It's very long-winded, I'm sorry, this is Weber, but debt is the primary consequence of the use of money. Weber very, very clearly identifies debt as a result of credit. I mean, he identifies it as the same thing. The term credit in the most general sense will be used to designate any exchange of goods presently possessed against the promise of a future transfer or disposal of utilities, no matter what they may be. When the action is rational, both parties expect an improvement in their position, regardless of what it consists in, over what it would be under in the present distribution of resources without the exchange. So, when it's rational, it's okay, but Weber is very clear to acknowledge, like the scholastics did, what is the most common basis of credit in money or in kind when it is granted for profit is very obvious. It is the fact that because the lender is usually in a better economic situation, the marginal utility of future expectations as compared with present ones is higher than it is for the borrower. Again, Weber's identifying inequality, he's identifying power, and that's the most common basis of credit and debt. And we haven't even gotten to his writings about the modern monetary system yet, which is how we're going to start to wind down this lecture. Bear with me here. If any of this is sounded redundant, it should, because it's completely confirming Zarlenga. So, Essay 32, monetary system of the modern state and different kinds of money, currency money. Quite apart from the monopoly of monetary regulation and issue, because of the tremendous importance of the financial transactions of the state, the behavior of the state treasurers in the monetary transaction is of crucial significance for the monetary system. So, let's read that again. The state of the behavior of the state treasurers, assholes like Bernanke and Geithner, is incredibly important and is of crucial significance for the monetary system. Above all, what kind of money they actually have at hand, and hence can pay out, and what kind of money they force on the public as legal tender, and further, what kind of money they actually accept, and what kind they partially or fully repudiate. No one's ever talked about this with Weber before. In terms of its legal properties, money can be defined defined as a legal means of payment, which everyone, also and especially the public pay offices, is obliged to accept and to pay, either up to a given amount or without limit. In terms of behavior of the state, it may be defined as money which public pay offices accept in payment and for which they in turn enforce acceptance in their payments. Legal compulsory money is that money in particular which they impose in their legal payments. Zarlenga says a lot of this. Zarlenga would often tell me that money has to be acceptable for taxes in order for it to be a proper monetary system. Now Weber gets straight up Aristotelian. Remember, Aristotle talks about how money is defined by law, not by commodity. Weber writes, by passing a suitable law, a state can turn any object into a legal means of payment and any chattel object into money in the sense of a means of payment. It can establish for them any desired set of value scales, or in the case of market money, currency relations. So laws can be passed to create money out of anything and to create the value of that money. Are there any questions so far? Is anyone? All right, good. So, Weber uses some of George Knapp's terminology, as I mentioned again, and we're going to break that down. But not only does Weber talk about debt and credit, not only does Weber have an Aristotelian definition of money, Weber also talks about monetary authorities. He used the word litric from the ancient Greek word litron, which means payment. And he talks about litric administrations. The definition of money as a legal means of payment and as the creature of the litric or monetary administration of political bodies is, from a sociological point of view, not exhaustive. This definition, to put in George F. Knapp's words, starts from the fact of the existence of debts, especially of tax debts to the state and of interest debts to the state. What is relevant for the legal discharge of such debts is the continuity of the nominal unit of money, even though the monetary material may have changed, or if the nominal unit should change, the historic definition of the new nominal unit. Beyond that, the individual today values the nominal unit of money as a certain proportional part of his nominal money income, and not as a chattel piece of metal or notes. So, individual today values the legal unit of money as a certain proportional part of his income. I mean, the legal aspect of it is more important to his actual income, more so than the value of that paper or metal. Furthermore, the state on its part needs the money which it receives through taxation or from other sources also as a means of exchange, though not only for that purpose, but often, in fact, to a very large extent for the payment of interest on its debt. But its creditors in the later case will wish to employ it as a means of exchange. Indeed, this is the main reason why they desire money. So, the state needs money as a means of exchange, but its creditors also want to use it as a means of exchange. The exchange possibility of money against other specific goods, which rests on this valuation in relation to marketable goods, will be called its substantive validity as opposed to its formal legal validity as a means of payment, and the frequently existing legal compulsion for its formal use as a means of exchange. So Weber is making a critical distinction between money's exchange value versus its substantive or its use value, as Marx might say. So not the value of the paper or the money, but its legal value. He maintains this throughout the writing. throughout this piece. The second change in the same direction for those persons who deal with the state, and because of the higher prices resulting from the lowered marginal utility of money to public bodies, become the possessors of larger money stocks. The purchasing power now at their disposal, that is, the lowering of the marginal utility of money for these possessors, can in turn result in an increase in prices paid to those from whom they purchase. If, on the other hand, the state were to withdraw from circulation part of the notes it receives, that is, if it should not pay them out again but destroy them, the result would be that the marginal utility of money of its lessened money stocks would rise, be the opposite of inflationary, deflationary move on the part of the monetary association. So, Weber's already acknowledging how modern monetary systems result in massive inequality, massive discrepancies in purchasing power. Weber notes that precious metals have normally become monetary standard, and this is due to the use of money as ornaments and as gifts in the past. But apart from purely technical factors, this was also determined by the fact that they were goods, which were typically dealt with by weight. Their maintenance in this function is not at first sight obvious, since today, for all except the smallest payments, everyone normally uses notes, especially bank notes, bank money, and expects to receive them in payment. There are important motives, however, to the retention of metal standards. So, Weber's already talking about banknotes, bank money, which is critical to the development of modern capitalism. And contrary to what Stephen Zarlenga says, banknotes is central in Weber's analysis. In all modern states, not only is the issue of money in the form of notes legally regulated, but it is monopolized by the state. It is either carried out directly by the state itself, or by one or a few issuing agencies enjoying special privileges, but subject to the control of the state, the banks of issue, central banks, the monetary authority. He actually writes about public currency. That doesn't mean publicly owned money, it just means publicly used money. This applies only to money which is actually paid out by public agencies and acceptance which is forced. In the long run, public currency money must naturally coincide with the effective currency. It can't be possibly official, a separate legal tender currency. So, public money doesn't necessarily mean sovereign money. Weber defines another term, restricted money. This means accessory, the money that circulates is accessory money, having a fixed relationship to some other currency money in the same monetary area. So this is space for complementary currencies. Weber's also talking about bimetal standards, metal and paper combination monetary. He writes also about note money extensively. For the purposes of a sociological theory of money, it's always the specific chart form of the document, including the specific formal meaning printed on it and which constitutes money, and not the claim to something else which it may, though it need not represent. In the case of unredeemable paper money, such a claim is altogether absent. So, again, note money, fiat currency. It is almost always the case that note money has first been issued as a redeemable form of provisional money. In modern times, it has been typically a medium of circulation, almost always in the form of banknotes. They have therefore been denominated in terms of units of an existing metal standard. Weber writes about government notes having been replaced by bank notes, or vice versa. It is of course true that the means of exchange and payment may exist which do not take a chartal form, are not coins or notes or other material objects. There is no doubt of this. It is not, however, expedient to speak of these as money, but to use the term unit of account, or some other term which according to the particular case is appropriate. It is characteristic of money that is associated with particular quantities of chartal artifacts. This is a property which is very far from being merely external or secondary importance. So there could be some deviation in Weber's terms from Zarlenga's. It's not entirely clear if Weber considers bank money or credit money real money, because it's not associated with actual chartal artifacts. But it's just a difference of terms. There's no real disagreement between Zarlenga and Weber's understanding of monetary creation. So, with regards to the formal and substantive validity of money, and modern times, it is true that by law and administrative action, a state can today ensure the formal validity of a type of money as the standard in its own area of power, provided it remains itself in a position to make payments in this money. It will not remain in a position to do this if it has allowed what was previously an accessory or provisional type of money to become free market money, in the case of metallic money, or autonomous paper money in the case of note money. This is because these types of money will then accumulate in the hands of the government until it commands no other kind and is hence forced to impose them in its own payments. And this specifically applies to England. There's references to the Bank of England in here. He talks about the English choosing gold or silver standards for a while. Weber writes, the adoption of pure paper standards has always been the result of political catastrophe. Rather, this has been the only way to meet the problem of an inability to pay what was previously the standard money. This is happening on a large scale today. Not sure if that jives exactly well with Zarlenga, who's noticing that bank money is being used regularly. Methods and aims of monetary policy, number 36 in Economy and Society. So in countries with gold exchange, the backing circulating medium, if it's not covered with gold, with commercial paper, claims to payments for goods which have been sold, which are guaranteed by safe persons, or in other words, proved entrepreneurs. The transactions of the note-issuing banks on their own accounts are as far as possible limited to dealing with such bills, to making loans on the security of stocks or goods, to the receipt of deposits, the clearing of check payments, and finally acting as financial agent for the state. So he's talking about central banks. The discount policy of the banks of issue consists in raising the rate of interest charged on the bills discounted when there is a probability that payments abroad will create a demand for gold sufficient to threaten the internal stock of gold, especially that in the hands of the issuing bank. The purpose is to encourage owners to form balances that take advantage of the higher rate of interest and to discourage domestic borrowing. The note-issuing banks occupy a position of great power in the system of commercial banks, since the latter are often dependent on the credit extended by the bank of issue. The bank of issue may influence the other banks to regulate the money market, that is, the conditions on which short-term credit is given in a uniform way, and from there proceed to a deliberate regulation of business credit, thereby influencing the direction the production of goods. This is within the framework of a capitalistic economic order, the closest approach to a planned economy, like the kind you would see in a communist society. Planned economy is a code word for communism. So these financial measures, borrowing, raising prices based on foreign demand, were all typical before the war. They were used in the interest of a monetary policy which was primarily orientated to the stabilization of currency, or in changes were desired, as in countries with restricted paper money, or at most to attempts to bring about a gradual rise in the foreign exchange value of money. So, for Weber, rational monetary policy means keeping prices between different countries stable, but strong interests exist which desire just the reverse policy. They favor a monetary policy of the following type: measures which would lead to a fall in foreign exchange prices of their own money in order to improve the position of exporting interests by by increasing the issue of money through free coinage of silver in addition to gold, which could mean instead of it, and even in some cases deliberate issue of paper money to decrease the value of money in relation to domestic goods, inflation, and thereby what is the same thing to raise the money prices of domestic goods. So the value of money goes down and the prices of goods goes up. Again, looking at that difference between substantive and legal validity of money, and how a rational monetary authority would want to try to keep that as consistent as possible. The object has been to improve prospects for profit in the production of such goods, an increase in the price of which, as reckoned in terms of domestic currency, was thought to be the first consequence of the increased amount of domestic money in circulation and the attendant fall in its foreign exchange value. The attendant process is termed inflation. It is at the same time an undoubted fact that in areas with an independent paper standard, situations of severe financial pressure, especially war, lead the monetary authorities to orientate their policy overwhelmingly to the financial requirements of war. So again, Weber's discussing all the connections between different types of monetary creation and debt and credit and war, and how this has expanded and shaped history. There are economic reasons in that here the creation of money takes place on the initiative of private interests, so that the demand for coinage is orientated to the needs of the market system for means of payment, as opposed to the public good. Weber's writing about the rise of Wall Street before it happened. Because of course this is all based on his analysis of the Bank of England, which was the role model for the Federal Reserve. Inflation through an increase in the quantity of the means of circulation is conceivable only as the result of a very gradual increase in the circulation through a lengthening of credit terms. The limits are elastic, but in the last resort this process is strictly limited by the necessity for maintaining the solvency of the note-issuing bank. If the bank issues too much money, it'll go insolvent, it'll go bankrupt. There's an acute danger of inflation only if there's a danger that the bank will become insolvent. Normally this is likely to occur only where there is a paper standard resulting from war needs. So, a rational monetary policy, according to Weber, can, in conformity with the definition of rationality consistently held to here, can only mean the exclusion of all such interests which are either not market-orientated, like the financial interests of the state, or interests which are not interested in the maintenance of stable exchange relations with other currencies as an optimum basis for rational calculation, but which on the contrary are primarily oriented to the creation of purchasing power for certain interest groups by means of inflation, into its maintenance even if there is no longer any need for the issue of new money from the point of view of public finances. Whether especially this later process to be praised or censored is naturally not a question capable of solution on empirical grounds, but of its empirical existence, of the empirical existence of a rational monetary policy, there can be no doubt. It is furthermore true that proponents of a point of view which is orientated to substantive social ideals can find a very important opening for criticism in the very fact that the creation of money and currency is, in a pure market economy, made an object of the play of interest orientated only to profitability. It is not concerned in terms of the right volume or the right type of money. Zarlenga was always talking about the right volume and the right type of money. So these private interests might, with reason, argue that it is only administrative money which can be managed, but not market money. Thus, the use of administrative money, especially paper money, which can be cheaply produced in any desired form and quantity, is from the point of view of a substantive rationality, whatever its goals, the only correct way to handle the monetary question. So, Weber is not necessarily for a gold or silver standard. He's arguing for fiat currency. It's the only way to handle modern monetary systems. But you notice he argues, however, that in the future, as in the past, it will be the interests of individuals rather than the ideas of an economic administration which will rule the world. He's arguing against Marxism. Thus, the possibility of conflict between formal rationality in the present sense and the substantive rationality which could theoretically be constructed for a monetary authority entirely free of any obligation to maintain exchange of metal has been demonstrated also for this point. So what that means is that even though fiat currency, paper money, could be used rationally, could be distributed in the right volume, it's still going to probably be used for private interests. So, Weber also has a few really important points with regard to a critical note on George Knapp's state theory of money, which Zarlenga also references. And thank you for bearing with me. I'm exhausted as well, but this stuff is really important. So Weber talks about the Bank of England again, an English gold standard, and how England gold standard forced Germany to demonetize its currency, and then France, Switzerland, other countries, Latin unit, finally India, had to react to the Bank of England in terms of its metal exchange. Against death, Knapp might say, meaning of a currency, no potion has yet been found. And there are interests of those in political authority, whose Knapp also assumes bear ultimate responsibility for monetary policy. And there are certain private interests, both are not necessarily primarily concerned with the maintenance of stable foreign exchange rates or domestic prices. These interests can, either from within the political and monetary administration, or by exercising a strong pressure on it, have an important influence on policy, which would lead to inflation, or Knapp, who strictly avoids the term, could only describe as a case of the issue of paper money, which is not admissible because it's not orientated to the internal rate of exchange. There are financial temptations to resort to inflation. So Weber talks about how German mark of inflation of 1/20th of its form and value in relation to most important domestic commodities and property objects would, once profits and wages adapt to the level of prices, mean that all internal commodities and labor services would be valued 20 times as high as before. And this means, for those in the fortunate situation, a reduction of war debt to 20 of its original level, talking about the German mark specifically. And the state receives increase from taxes as nominal money rates improve. And this is attractive to private interests. The prospect is even more attractive when in terms of thinking about paying foreign debts. Think of our foreign debt to China. Trying to truncate some of this. Furthermore, there are entrepreneurs who would be only too glad to see the prices of their product increase 20-fold through inflation if it is altogether possible the nominal wages of workers, because of lack of bargaining power or through lack of understanding of the situation or for any other reason, were to increase only 5 or possibly 10-fold. And this is the exact problem we're having today. Workers' earnings don't keep up with inflation. It is usual for acute inflation from public finance motives of this kind to be sharply disapproved of by experts in economic policy. On the other hand, a deliberate but very gradual increase in the volume of the means of circulation, of the type which is sometimes undertaken by central banks facilitating the extension of credit, bank money, is often looked upon favorably as a means of stimulating speculative attitudes. By holding out prospect of greater profits, it is held to stimulate the spirit of enterprise, and with that an increase in capitalist production by encouraging the investment of free money and profit-making enterprise, rather than its investment in fixed interest securities, social structures. We have to ask, however, what is the effect of this more conservative policy on the stability of exchange rates? Its direct effect, the consequence of the stimulation of the spirit of enterprise, may be to create a more favorable balance of payment, or at least to check the fall in foreign exchange position on domestic currency. The cost of such an expansion of the stock of currency money, which would be relatively harmless to foreign exchange position, would be gradually paid out by the same groups which be subject to the confiscation in case of acute inflation. So this includes all those whose nominal income remains the same, or who have securities with a constant nominal level. Above all, the receivers of fixed interest bond income and those who earn salaries which are fixed, and that they can only be raised through severe struggle. So this expansion of credit hurts people with fixed incomes, fixed salaries, fixed wages, is what Weber is trying to say. So, exchange relationships between two countries, it should be possible to be regulated by a monetary authority, according to Weber, especially when concerned with the means of circulation to make certain estimates based on anterior demand conditions periodically observed in the market of the probable fluctuations given stock means of payment which will be required. So Weber's arguing for monetary authority that is actually maintaining stable exchange rates. This is exactly what the Mead Act does. So the monetary authority, and this is Weber writing, would be focused on the channels the inflationary process would follow. Who would be the primary and subsequent recipients of newly issued money? I mean, Weber acknowledges that a modern monetary system could potentially be used to give money to the public, although he acknowledges that more often than not this is not going to be the case. But still, he's arguing for a rational monetary authority, or at least the possibility of it. And mind you, he's doing this deliberately in order to show how irrational most monetary authorities, most central banks are in empirical reality. Much like Zarlenga, Weber is also completely against futures markets. Weber argues that anticipatory needs should be based upon prior data, prior needs, but he's not for gambling, not for financial speculation, not for earning interest on future prices, on predictions about the issue of additional currency units or resultant increases in prices. So, even though these things aren't rational, the existence of such policies is a historical fact, according to Weber. To be sure, in a crude form and under much more primitive conditions of money, economy, inflation, and deflation, have been repeatedly attempted with the Chinese copper currency, although they have led to serious failures. In America, inflation has been proposed. Knapp, however, since his book operates on the basis only of what he calls demonstrable assumptions, contents himself with giving the advice that the state ought to be careful in the issue of independent paper money. The state ought to be careful in the issue of independent paper money. Does independent paper money mean sovereign money? I think it kind of does. If we keep reading, since Knapp is entirely orientated to create criterion of exchange rate stability, this advice appears to be relatively unequivocal. Inflationary debasement and depreciation in foreign exchange are usually very closely associated, but they are not identical. It is far from true that every inflation is primarily caused by the foreign exchange situation. So, domestic inflation, potentially. Knapp does not explicitly admit, but neither does he deny, that an inflationary money regime has been urged for reasons of price policy, among others by the American silver producers during the Free Silver Campaign, and by the farmers who demanded greenbacks. But not only in these cases. It is probably comforting to Knapp that has never been successful over a long period. Weber references not only the fundamental problem, the fundamental cause that rise to capitalism and global inequality, there's also a reference within economy to sovereign currency and greenbacks, and to the possibility that the right kind of money can be distributed to the right people, the public. It's hidden within here, and you probably wouldn't be able to even understand it if you hadn't read The Lost Science of Money.
So he references universal basic income pretty much same time.
Not exactly.
No.
He's not exactly referencing universal basic income, thank you. But he is referencing greenbacks, which are interest-free paper money that Abraham Lincoln utilized to preserve the Union during the Civil War, which we're going to cover more in future chapters. And there's long greenback movements after the Civil War, and greening the dollar. I mean, what we're fighting for, the Need Act, is part of the greenback movement. Weber references our own freaking movement back in 1919, 1920. So it's not quite the same thing as universal basic income, but it could be. Like, he's acknowledging that inflationary money, I mean, he's talking about how this is the closest thing to a planned economy, how this is the closest thing to a socialist economy. We're almost done, people. So, Weber says, he writes, "We also want to know what are the sources of an increase in the supply of precious metal, whether it stemmed from booty, as in the case of Cortez and Pizarro, conquistadors, from enrichment through trade, as in China in the early Christian era since the 16th century, or from an increase in production. If it's an increase in production, does it become cheaper, and why? What is the part of which played by the changes in non-monetary uses of the metal?" He writes about changes in monetary demand arising from changes in customs, touching the use of money, such as in small transactions. These are all subjects that Weber argues need to be discussed in monetary theory. Weber's arguing for monetary theory. He's arguing for a lost science of money, in spite of what Zarlenga has to say about Weber. Finally, it is necessary to discuss the regulation of demand for money in a market economy and to inquire into the meaning of this concept. One thing is clear, that the actual demand for means of payment on the part of parties to market relationships, which determines the creation of free market money under free coinage. Furthermore, it is the effective demand for means of payment, and above all for credit, on the part of market participants in combination with care for the solvency of banks of issue and the norms which have been established with this in view, which determines the policies for means of circulation of modern banks of issue. All of this is orientated to the requirements of interested parties as in conforming with the general character of the modern economic order. It is only this which, under the formal legal conditions of our economic system, can correctly be called the demand for money. So again, this whole supply and demand thing, Weber's critical of it, just like Zarlenga. This concept is thus quite indifferent with respect to substantive criteria, as is the related one of the effective demand for goods. In a market economy, there is an inherent limit to the creation of money, only in the case of metallic money. But it is precisely the existence of this limit, as has already been pointed out, which constitutes the significance of precious metals for monetary systems. So the restriction of money to a material not capable of unlimited production like paper, but metal with a finite amount, sets a limit to any sort of creation of money. And there are consequences for this. He's talking about the consequences of shifting from metal to fiat. Even though, so metal doesn't exclude a certain amount of elasticity, certain ways to expand the monetary supply through debasement of the currency. But where money is made out of material which is for practical purposes capable of unlimited production like paper, there is no such mechanical limit. In this case, there is no doubt that the free decision of the political authorities, which is the regulator of the quantity of money, unimpeded by any such mechanical constraints. That, however, remains, as has been indicated, determination by the conception of the financial interests of the political authority, or even under certain circumstances, the purely personal interests of the members of the administrative staff. And this was true of the use of the printing presses directly by the Red Armies for their own needs, according to Weber. So he gives a communist example as well as a capitalist example, which is far more common. In spite of the mechanical character of its operation, the metallic standard nevertheless makes possible a high degree a higher degree of formal rationality in a market economy because it permits action to be orientated wholly to market advantages. It talks about Austria and Russia. The monetary policy of Literature authorities under a pure paper standard is not necessarily orientated either to the purely personal interests of the authority or the administrative staff or to the financial interests of the state, which would mean the least expensive creation of the greatest possible volume of means of payment, without concern for what happens to the currency as a means of exchange. So the money can potentially become useless if you make too much of it, inflation again. But the danger that such an orientation would become dominant is nonetheless continually present under a paper standard. There's always a threat of inflation under a paper standard. This doesn't exist in a metal standard, sort of, according to Weber. We don't necessarily disagree with that. But from the point of view of the formal order of a market economy, the existence of this danger is an irrational factor present in any form of monetary system other than a metallic standard. So, however, incredibly primitive and older forms of the quantity theory of money were, there's no denying that any inflation with the issue of paper money determined by the financial means of the state is in danger of causing debasement of currency. And just to end this, Weber argues with this whole idea that Knapp has, that everyone is both a creditor and a debtor. Weber's like, no, most people are just debtors. Most people don't have the opportunity to extend credit. He argues with one of Knapp's central premises with regard to that. And but other than that, he also concludes with the comments that, rightly or wrongly, some can hope that this tendency of inflation in paper economies will lead to the transformation of a market economy into socialism. Some may expect proof for the thesis that only a regulated economy with small-scale production units is capable of substantive rationality regardless of the sacrifices its establishment would entail. It is impossible for science to decide such questions, but at the same time, it is its duty to state the facts about these effects as clearly and as objectively as possible. So, Weber stops short of actually advocating any one kind of monetary system. He certainly advocates for monetary theory and for monetary studies and delineates what should be included in that. But unlike Zarlenga, Weber does not have a clear solution he's advocating. That's the advantage of the law of science of money. You have to understand Weber's concern with staying objective at his time, but that's not an issue for Zarlenga, who clearly argues for sovereign currency and for a monetary authority, a rational monetary authority, along the lines of which Weber describes. So, reading these two books together blew my mind. Reading Weber after reading this gave me a whole new look at Weber. The whole notion of rationality in Weber probably has more to do with bookkeeping and bank money than was originally ever thought. And so, I mean, the bad news for Stephen is that he missed a really important source of support, which is too bad. It could have sped things up a lot. But the good news for our purposes is that we have a major support, major source of authority in Max Weber for Stephen's work. The fact that these two works support each other, the fact that Weber supports Zarlenga, several decades before Zarlenga writes any of this stuff, obliges the entire discipline of sociology to return to Weber's writings on credit and debt and money and modern money systems. And this Weber's writings in this book are going to help create a paradigm shift within the discipline of sociology against the entire discipline of economics, which justifies the use of debt-based bank money. And so, I said a lot tonight. I hope the significance of this isn't quite lost on you. This is all stuff that's going to become increasingly important as school begins again next fall. This is all stuff I'm going to be taking to my teachers and to other students within the new school, and I'm expecting the conversation over this to get pretty interesting pretty quickly. So, that said, there's probably no way I would have understood any of Weber's writings on credit, debt, money, had I not read this first. So, these two books, there's a certain hermeneutical arc, as I believe Ricoeur would call it, between these two texts. And I'm exhausted. I'm sure you all are too. But we'll leave it for there. Any questions or comments or anything? No, that's fine. I'll upload this to YouTube as soon as possible. Please leave comments and questions in the comments section on the YouTube clip, because we got a lot of work to do. We have to relook at the lost sociology of money now. So, but with that, good night.